Hey everybody, good morning. This is Dan. What I want to do today is a couple of things. We're going to have a quiz this week, and this is what we're going to call a sort of a low stakes quiz. It's not a lot of points, it doesn't mean a lot in the big scheme of grading, but the reason I'm doing it is I want you to try to remember some of these core concepts for the class. I mean, to me, it's not so much what grade you get in the class, but it's what you take away from it. And as I've been reading a lot about learning lately, one of the best ways to make some of these things sink in is to have quizzes and low stakes quizzes, so you're not too threatened, but at the same time you have a chance to digest some of the material and have a reason to remember it. So, and excuse me because I'm going to read off of some notes here. But some of the things in this quiz you're going to need to know, and I'll give you everything that's going to be on the quiz. So if you watch this video, you should be in good shape. I want you to define capitalism, socialism, and communism, and I'm not looking for like a long, drawn-out textbook definition here, but I want you to be aware of these different words and what they mean, mainly based on some of the answers in the discussion board. I think some of us are struggling for this idea of pure capitalism or pure socialism, and there really isn't any economy that's ever been 100% pure this or that, with maybe the exception of the Soviet Union after Marxism took hold there. So I think you all know what capitalism is at this point, and basically all you need to know is that it's an economy based on free market, laissez-faire, the free market economy. Many people would refer to what we have here in the U.S. as capitalism, and certainly that is the case, but it's not 100% pure capitalism, and as we talk about socialism here briefly, we can get a clearer picture of why that is. I'm looking at the definition of capitalism again, so the core of that, and I'm looking in the resources link on our website, the core of that is an economic system in which private capital or wealth is used in the production or distribution of goods. The dominance of private owners of capital and of production for profit. So again, free market, privately held means of production, privately held wealth. Now, if we look at socialism on our same term sheet, the first thing it says is a theory or system of social organization based on state or collective ownership. Now, I think to a large extent we could all agree that there's an element of socialism in this country, and not so much the state or collective ownership part, although there are some state-run or state-regulated industries. Most of the utilities are regulated by the government, the Public Utilities Commission, that sort of thing. But what I really want to look at here in socialism, and this is a definition that's changed over time, is the very end of the definition we're using, any various system of liberal social democracy which retains a commitment to social justice and social reform, or features some degree of state intervention in the running of the economy. I think it's fair to say that the United States has certain elements of socialism to it. The most obvious would be Social Security, Medicare, this idea of some government intervention towards social justice causes, which would be support for the elderly. Now healthcare, of course, is out there as a social justice or a social issue that the state maintains and gets its money to do that through taxes. So, I think it's not true to say that the U.S. is 100% capitalist, that there's some socialist elements here. And I think that if you follow politics at all, especially during the Obama administration, some of the conservative pundits have said, "Oh, Obama's a socialist," and I don't know that I don't know if that's entirely a negative. I think almost everybody supports Social Security and some social programs, and government regulation has certainly proven to be necessary in the regulation of monopolies, in the regulation of banking, As we get into the robber barons and the Gilded Age, which is sort of going to be the next phase of the course, you begin to understand that runaway free market capitalism leaves a lot of people out and creates commerce situations that are unfair. So, understand those two definitions. Capitalism means totally free market, no regulation, and socialism can mean a lot of things, but in modern times it really means um, um, some attention paid to society, both through social welfare programs and also through some regulation. And if you follow politics right now, Bernie Sanders is out there and says, I'm a socialist Democrat. So he's not really using it in a negative term. He's not saying that businesses should be run by the government. He's just saying that there should be some social outreach along with capitalism. And I'm not advocating any position or advocating Bernie Sanders for that matter, but just so you kind of know where that's coming from. Now, communism, on the other hand, again, is subject to many definitions, but the one definition that is sort of the classic definition is that there is no private ownership of anything. So there's no private ownership of land, there's no private ownership of companies, of corporations, of manufacturing, and certainly that's the case if we go back and look at the USSR, under Stalin, there was everything was owned by the state. So that's this extreme form of economic control in the hands of the government. So just so you know those basic definitions, and I think most of you already do, but that's what I'm looking for there. The other thing is on the quiz, I'd like you to know about intellectual property and at least what that is. So if I say intellectual property to you, you know that involves patents, trademarks, that sort of thing. And keep in mind that the patent law started in the U.S. with the Patent Act of 1790. And what you probably should take away from that is that patents give the inventor of a technology a monopoly, the ability to exclusively own the rights to that invention, whether it is to license it or to manufacture it. And the main reason that Alexander Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson, the founding fathers, thought that patent law was important was as a way to motivate people to invent, to motivate innovation. This idea that if you create something, you should be able to own it, stimulates creativity in society. At least that's the thought. And I think for the most part that's been pretty effective. I mean, people and especially companies don't want to put a lot of time into research and development only to have someone steal their idea and profit from it. So just have sort of an idea of what patent law is all about and why it exists. And I think we had a pretty good discussion about that on the discussion board. The next thing we should cover, and I apologize, I'm sort of going out of order here, is this idea that capitalism arrived on the first ships. Just know what that means, and it's quite simply that capitalism in some form has been part of this country since the first Europeans landed on the East Coast. And we read about that, we talked about it at length, and we don't need to go in any greater detail about it. Let's see, you should know what the word capital means, and we talked about it last week in the discussion boards a little bit, but it simply means in the context of business, wealth or money that's out there to help finance a business. So if you want to own a railroad or start a railroad, you need capital to do that. If you hear that a industry requires high capital, you know that means it's expensive to get into that industry. If you hear the terms in the news that Yahoo or Google has been capitalized at $20 billion, that means the estimated worth of the company. So you should know what capital is. The next thing you should know is this idea of the American system of manufacture. And in last week's lecture and notes, we talked about Eli Whitney and this idea of interchangeable parts. and that's really important as we try to get our hands around manufacturing in this country that's going to come later. This idea of interchangeable parts is really responsible for everything, from, well, the assembly line for one, because people are putting individual parts on whatever they're building as this unit's going by. And if you didn't have interchangeable parts, you wouldn't have mass assembly techniques, and that's important as well. So know what the American system of manufacture is. It refers to this idea of interchangeable parts, which for the large part in manufacturing started in the U.S. Now, there are ideas from the reading you could see that went all the way back to Europe, but for a large part, as far as industrial capitalism and mass manufacturing is concerned, it's a U.S. thing. The important takeaway with the American system of manufacture, something just for you to think about, is that for the most part, I think that the country lost its ability for artisanship or craftsmanship, or at least to a large extent, with the advent of interchangeable parts, because now a person in manufacturing, a person who works at the factory, only works on one thing. In other words, if your job is to assemble bearings, that's what you do, and then you pass those bearings down the line. And so now individuals are working on components, and they're no longer working on the whole part. So this idea that a person is an expert garment maker or is an expert tailor is still out there, but when it came time for people to just make sleeves or to just make buttons or to just make zippers, part of this idea of being an artist or a craftsman was lost. And I think it really changed the way that work was done in this country. So for the quiz, just know what the American system of manufacture refers to, and then for your own thinking about things, just know that many theorists believe that craftsmanship in this country was largely lost as we got to these modern assembly techniques where you would only handle one part of what it was you were manufacturing. So kind of cool to think about. The next thing to talk about is I just want to quickly introduce this week's module, and it's very brief, and it's about slavery and capitalism. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. I probably should spend more on it. But I feel a need to address it for a couple of reasons. As far as slavery goes, pre-Civil War in this country, there are many theories about slavery and business and capitalism out there that have been advanced over the years. Some people, like Karl Marx, for example, and other theorists, have called slavery sort of a pre-capitalism system. In other words, there's no wage labor involved. Human labor is exploited for personal gain. And that's a takeaway, but I think this idea of pre-capitalism and slavery is not really that important of a theory for what I want to get across. There's also a famous historian who wrote in the 1940s or 50s named Eric Williams. And his theory was that because of slavery, capitalism arose. In other words, the money earned from the slave trading industry gave England enough money to fund the Industrial Revolution, and the same thing here in this country to some extent. And those theories are all well and good and probably valid to some extent. But what I want you to take away from slavery and capitalism, and I tried to express it or tried to give you really brief reading materials, is that in a capitalist free market society, there is often, almost always, exploitation in some form. And I think that slavery is an extreme form of exploitation. As you go through the readings this week, you'll see how slave labor was exploited to fuel the marketplace. In other words, there was a demand for cotton, and there was a demand for tobacco before that, and that demand created sort of a need or created a profitable slavery system. and nobody was immune. The readings touch upon this, but if you look at slavery in this country as a North-South thing, people in the North certainly enjoyed the fruits of slavery by buying cotton fabric, wearing cotton clothes, and so there's this exploitation that goes on. The interesting thing about this is, and it's something I'm really interested in, is this disconnection between production and consumption, where people are wearing slave-produced goods or eating slave-produced goods prior to the Civil War, and they may not have really believed in slavery, but this long-distance connection between production of the cotton or picking of the cotton and wearing of the clothes, this distance, this space, makes people forget about the direct link between the two. So that's of interest, and that still happens today. One of the things I'm trying to do throughout this course is to look at these historic events like slavery and relate them to today. So I not only gave you a brief article about slavery and capitalism, but I also gave you a brief article about a substance called coltan, C-O-L-T-A-N, which is in many smartphones and iPads, that's produced under tribal rulership in Africa. And again, this idea of exploitation is pretty far removed from us, but a lot of the components in our cell phones can be traced back to Africa, to abusive labor practices, and we don't think about that on a day-to-day basis. And now that we know that, it's probably not going to change our behavior. We're still probably going to upgrade our cell phone, every 2 years as our contracts run out. But there is this element of exploitation that always goes along with capitalism. And if we're going to move towards this idea of moral capitalism or thinking about moral capitalism, we need to be aware that there's always circumstances to our consumption. So keep that in mind. The last part of the unit this week talks about free market stores and a woman named Patience Brayton from the late 1700s. And I just thought that that was an interesting read because during the time of slavery in this country, Patience Brayton and other people, other women for the most part, created this this marketplace, these stores that sold goods that were not produced by slavery. So that just shows you that that's one way that the public can, I guess, protest against exploitation. And you see it today all the time too. And I don't know that it's always effective, but this idea of grassroots movements where people only sell or only consume things that are manufactured in a more moral sense or harvested in a more moral sense. You'll see this in coffee today, this idea of free trade coffee. You'll see it in other goods and services that advertise they're produced under fair labor practices, and to some extent even organic things that you buy are produced without pesticides, and it's sort of this idea that not only is it healthier, but we're not supporting that industry, that pesticide industry. So keep that in mind. These campaigns to sell free market goods pop up now and again over the period of time, and it's something to be aware of. You've heard of boycotts, people that boycott goods or services for unfair labor practices. So just keep that in the back of your head. It's a part of the history of business in American society that consumers often have some power to dictate the terms of the marketplace. And again, I don't know that it's always effective, but it is out there. So that's a lot to cover. Be ready for this quiz. It's no big deal. I just want you to sort of think about some of these definitions, and I will see you next time. We're going to start talking about the Gilded Age, and that's the time of the robber barons, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Gould, certainly J.P. Morgan, and that's sort of exciting stuff. We're going to spend some time on that. We'll get to that next. In the meantime, have a great day. I think you're all doing a great job on the discussion board, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.